So Nicola Davies is a zoologist and award-winning writer of children's books. Given her background, it's no surprise that a theme underpinning her books is the encouragement to respect and wonder at the natural world in all its diversity. Nicola deals with the most profound subjects in ways that are accessible to readers of all ages. She's written fiction, non-fiction, and picture book texts. And now we discover she's a talented artist. Her first self-illustrated book, Last, The Story of a White Rhino, was published by Tiny Owl this month. Is there no end to her talent, I wonder? Cathy Fisher has been a teacher and is a talented artist and illustrator. Like Nicola, her work has a deep connection with the natural world and a very tender depiction of humanity. Together, they have created 3 stunning picture books published by Graffeg. It's impossible to think of a more perfect partnership for these 3 books. So welcome to In the Reading Corner to both of you.
Thank you.
We're going to have a chance to talk about all 3 books, but obviously we're going to focus mainly on the book that's coming out very soon, which is called The New Girl. But to start with, I'd like to know a little bit about how this partnership came about.
Completely by the happiest accident. I had written the text of Perfect about the birth of a disabled child, and I was having enormous problems selling it. Publishers were very wary about publishing something about such a difficult subject, but I was determined. But I needed to find an illustrative collaborator. And I'd been looking. I was having treatment for my shoulder in this physiotherapist's place in agony, looking at the walls, trying to distract myself from the pain. And there was this beautiful, beautiful picture. I've actually got a print of it on the wall back there. Mm-hmm. And I said, who did that? They said, oh, that's my friend Cathy. Do you want me to put you in touch?
We met in Monmouth in a cafe. You read me the story and I was just like, ooh. And then had a meeting with Graffeg, went through my portfolio.
And then we
have history, as they say.
Wonderful book, Perfect. It is a book that deals with a sensitive subject and one about which you need great sensitivity. Were you both thinking about that as you approached it?
I knew that it was sensitive. And I knew enough about the debates around disability, different abilities. I knew that there would be people who'd hate it. But that's partly the reason that I wrote the book, because I wanted to open that dialogue up, particularly for the siblings of children with disabilities. I have very, very direct experience of that within my own family and with close friends. And that pattern of shock within the family being then replaced by acceptance and an embracing of and a joy in the different abilities of that family member is a pattern I've seen repeated. But I really wanted to make the space for the siblings and the family members to say, actually, it was really difficult. Mm-hmm. And we didn't rejoice when this baby was born with this problem, but we came to be happy and to realise that it was okay. But I've had a lot of flack for that, a lot of flack.
It's about having an honesty in your approach, isn't it? I think which I think comes through your writing. What about from a artistic or illustrative point of view? Are there different sets of challenges with that book?
For me, it felt like a really, really, really important story. I'm one of 9. And I remember the feeling of every time there was a new baby, my heart sinking. So I could identify with that feeling and also the confusion, because there's a confusion of love and disappointment and anger. And as a kid, you can't really process it all. And you didn't specifically.
Yeah, I deliberately didn't specify, although I had a disability in my head.
Yeah,
I didn't specify. We had the same idea.
Yeah. And the idea of the Swifts and the boy loving Swifts kind of eased it in and helped me greatly. And at the time I was living near Bristol, And so I used that sense of Bristol and the Swiss in Bristol for it. But there was a time at which, at one point, I was illustrating the baby in the cot, and I purposely put the cot bars across his eyes, or her eyes, and I was scribbling anger for the little boy. So I'd made myself the little boy, and I burst into tears and was shocked, because lots of your deep psyche comes out when you're illustrating, I think, and I think my own sense, and so that kind of carried me through and made me feel great empathy for the little boy, for the baby.
Your illustration of that little baby, which was drawn from life, because what's it, your
my sister, until very, very recently, fostered babies. So I'd also had a lot of experience with babies who were born with difficulties and problems, and used her and her advice and her help too.
There's a wonderful moment when, as a writer, you see the illustration that your collaborator has created, and you see new things that you hadn't seen in your story. And that picture of the little baby, I saw that little face and I realised that actually the person who was going to be taking the lead in this relationship between the little boy and his younger sister was the disabled sister.
Wow.
That she was going to be the one
Yeah.
who was going to be teaching him.
That's lovely. It's a shame we don't have time to spend more on that one book, because in half an hour I've got to cover 3 books and get onto your new book as well. So it feels like we're moving on rather quickly. But your second book, The Pond, dealt with bereavement, and like Perfect, it had underpinning it the view that nature has the power to heal. Is that something that's important in both of your lives?
Totally, very much so. As a child, for me, it was the fields, and there was difficulty in my childhood, but it was nature, it was the fields, it was the birds, it was the haymaking. And that's been the thread throughout my whole life now.
Yeah, I mean, the same for me. And at times both in my childhood and my adult life particularly when I've had really traumatic, life-changing events, it's been nature that has got me through and has comforted me as solidly as literally a shoulder to cry on. I have laid on my lawn sobbing onto the breast of the earth.
That's a lovely way to put it.
And known that deep comfort, and also that sense of you're part of something bigger, and whatever ghastliness you are going through, this old world keeps turning round,
Before we move on to the new girl, while we're talking about this connection with nature, can I ask whether you think that reading also has a similar role to play to nature in this respect?
I think it's healing power. I think it does lots of things. It offers an escape. It offers a sense of fellow feeling and identification, particularly for children, I think, who feel that they are different, that they don't have friends. Somewhere in literature, you'll find a person who's like you and who will hold your hand. Yeah. And you may be bonkers and strange, but hey, bonkers and strange is quite good. Look at me, I'm bonkers and strange. I think there's absolutely that. But in terms of connecting with nature, I think it's with Jackie's Lost Words project with Robert McFarlane, naming is important. Naming, explaining, describing, looking. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that reading can do for children, it can both turn them inwards to an interior world that they can furnish and enjoy, but it also says, okay, look out there at all these things that you can discover. And this text and these pictures will help you with that.
So for art too, it has this capacity, doesn't it, Cathy?
Oh, absolutely. For me, it's vital. And I think the wonder of picture storybooks is that the pictures help the story, and as words give you access to all sorts of emotions. And sometimes emotions that aren't there in the words, and that there are no words for. That for me is where it's most important.
Yeah. Before we do move on, I wanted to ask you specifically about your methods of working and whether you think of your work as illustration or as art.
For me, it's art, my art, but it is illustration because you're telling a story with it. So I just call myself an artist illustrator. People can call me whatever they like.
and it's painted work.
I use mixed media, so it's paint and ink and pencil crayon. One of my favourite mediums is actually like a wax crayon that's water soluble. So yeah, I draw into it and paint into it. I paint in layers, less like a jigsaw, but more like building up lots of layers. And there's a lot of serendipity, and there's a lot of mistakes, and there's a lot of rejects.
Mistakes are good. Out of the mistakes come interesting things very often. And I guess that's why it's so textured, your work. And I suspect if I were to see it in real life, I would get more of the texture than I do even when I see it.
Yeah. Sometimes it gets lost in the printing, yeah.
So let's talk about The New Girl then, which is the latest book. Would one of you just introduce us briefly to the story?
This little girl starts in a new school, and she's very different from the children around her. And they don't like the difference, and she's very rejected and probably bullied because of it. But what makes this story a little bit different is it's told from the perspective of the bully. So we see how the bully feels about this kid. But then we see how this little girl reacts to the bullying. And she has an amazing, beautiful response that utterly subverts the cruelty, but also shows who she is as a person and gives something beautiful from her culture. And there's a picture with no words, Cathy's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful illustration, with a little girl who is obviously Japanese and her very Caucasian bullier. And they're on either side of the double page spread with an origami flower between them. And that is the moment when the narrator, who has been bullying, sees this little girl as a person for the first time, and therefore sees how totally unacceptable her behaviour has been. But once again, the little Japanese child meets this with grace. She teaches all the children in her class to fold origami flowers. And it's only on the very last page that we hear the new girl's name. When I walked home, it wasn't with the new girl, but with my friend, Kiku. She is named after a flower and made our classroom bloom.
I did have a question actually about the girl being Japanese, and I just wondered whether this had come out of your experience in Australia, or had you seen her as Japanese, Nicola?
Well, I'd always seen her as Japanese because of origami. And I always imagined she was in a Canadian school.
I had the same.
Yeah.
And then I said, I think she's Japanese and she's gone to North America or somewhere. And you went, well, yeah.
That's so interesting. That's me working a little bit too hard on trying to find out where these things come from, because I had imagined in my head, erroneously, that this was a real flower originally and became an origami flower because of that natural world connecting everything. But
that's a beautiful interpretation.
That's great. That's a lovely thing. That's your story. I mean, that again is the wonderful thing about a simple picture book text.
Yeah.
Is that there's enough space for the reader.
Yeah. And the same with the illustrations. I wanted not to give too much information. I wanted the reader to be able to interpret it their own way, but I didn't want to dictate at all.
But this beautiful lotus, because it is a lotus flower, isn't it, that she creates, and that evokes so much symbolically. The kind of new life. It crosses religions. It grows in dreadful places.
There's so much more narrative in Cathy's illustration There's so much more. There's the fantastic cultural references. There's amazing symbolism. And it's all there for you to discover and explore.
So all of the other books that you've done together seem to have really resonated with you in a very personal way. What about this theme of bullying? How did that impact on your lives?
I was very lucky and was never actually personally bullied in any sort of cruel way, apart from siblings, which I forget about, actually, because I'm one of 9. So a lot of bullying there, actually. At school, I'm quite shy and I'm a bit of a sit on the fence girl, and I tended to not take anybody's side. And I was very good at becoming invisible, and I quite like that.
I went to lots of different primary schools because my parents moved around quite a bit. So I was very often the new girl. And I was a toxic mixture as far as being on the receiving end of bullying is concerned. I was fat and clever and a bit weird, as we said. And so I was very often on the receiving end of bullying. But on one occasion, I was in a school with a very small class. There were 7 of us in the class, and there were 2 little girls in this class who we bullied. And I joined in with that, and it was really nasty bullying. And I remember it now and feel physically sick. But I also remember the feeling of kind of herd compulsion that brings you to that, and how you absolutely do not see the recipient of your bullying as a person. They're just a way for you to create a sense of identity with your group. And I absolutely know that feeling. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write it from the point of view of the bully.
Nicola, would you read to us?
Yeah. I just want to read a dedication, actually,
Yes.
which is from both of us.
Yes.
This book is dedicated to all children who struggle to be seen. And it's also with love and thanks to Jackie Morris for kindness, space and time, which he has afforded both of us over the years.
That's fantastic.
And there's a beautiful first page without words, which suggests the journey that this little Japanese girl is making across the world. And I won't give it away because it's just divinely lovely. The new girl didn't look like us. She didn't understand a thing we said. Even when we shouted, she was wrapped up like a parcel. We wondered what she hid beneath those clothes. Her lunchbox food smelled funny, so we made her sit apart to eat it. At the end of every afternoon, she walked away from school alone. Every day we laughed at her. We caught cruelty like a cold that drew the winter down around us all. But in the middle of that dark time, a flower came. It bloomed right on our teacher's desk. We stared at it in wonder. Who could have made this lovely thing? Every day there was another. They made us smile. They made the sun shine in our classroom. When no more came, we waited. Days and days. We were so sad. Our teacher said that we should try and make our own. I took a sheet of paper and I tried to fold a flower. Instead, I made a crumpled mess. I scrunched it up and threw it to the floor. The new girl picked it up. She smoothed out all my creases. Then carefully, with clever fingers, she folded up a flower and held it out to me. And then we've got that wordless spread with the 2 little faces and the flower in the middle. That day, we all learned how to fold flowers from a sheet of paper. We learned their names in a whole new language. Shobu, Akabara, Suren, Tsubaki, Iris, Rose, Lotus, Camellia, Tulip. And we made a garden. When I walked home, it wasn't with the new girl. but with my friend, Kiku. She is named after a flower and made our classroom bloom.
That's just beautiful. I want to talk a little bit about the writing and then a bit about the illustration. So when I read that book on my iPad here, I heard you reading it, Nicola, because I've heard you read so many times, I can't but help hear your voice with your text. There's something in the cadence that is just so you. It's poetic and it's lyrical. How important is sound and rhythm to you in writing?
Massively, massively important. I mean, I'm writing something much, much longer at the moment. I'm writing a YA novel for Firefly, and I really have to stop trying to make my sentences all iambic pentameters because, you know, you can't do it. You can't do it. It sounds weird. So the sound of the rhythm of a sentence is incredibly, incredibly important to me. Mm-hmm. It's got to feel good in your throat, in your mouth, in your heart when you read it aloud.
It's also an elevation in the text which takes it, I think, beyond the specific. So that line, but in the middle of that dark time, a flower came. This makes it far more universal than the story of this one child. Is that just intuitive, or are you trying to achieve that effect in your writing?
It is intuitive. But I'm always thinking about that bigger frame. What I really like in all art forms is the detail that is the silver bullet that gives you the bigger message. So that's what I think about with my stories. I want to focus on these little details, the little details that make you recognize, that make that moment where there's a resonance in your own life, but at the same time, you see the bigger echo. So it's like a small voice in a big space, and you hear the echo of the big space from that small voice.
Yeah. There was a line in particular. I'm going to ask you both about favourite lines and favourite pictures in a minute, just to give you a heads up. But my favourite line from the book is, "She smoothed out all my creases." This is not just the creases on the paper, but this is something very deep in her formation of her character. And that line just said so much. It's wonderful. So, Cathy, when you were given the manuscript, was there anything in particular?
There's a line in it: "We caught cruelty like a cold that drew the winter down around us all." That kind of became a very important picture in my head that I sort of wove things around.
Well, my favourite picture, it's impossible to choose a favourite because they're all so beautiful and they all carry. But my favourite page is "The new girl picked it up. She smoothed out all my creases." Because that's one of those lines that I wrote and then realised what I'd written. It's like the empty chair in The Day War Came. But the picture that goes with "She smoothed out all my creases," it's astonishingly beautiful. It's simply a piece of paper that has been folded many times in a pattern, but also a bit scrunched.
Well, it was origami. It was an origami piece unfolded.
It says so much, but it is also just so beautiful. You could look at it and look at it and look at it.
Well, I also wanted to make it look a bit like the sun as well.
Yeah, so you can see there's loads going on in every...
So layered, it really is. I'm going to pick out the kintsugi, the repaired vase. This seemed in many ways a quiet image, the kind of repairing and making something beautiful out of something broken. It seemed to me that we could apply that to so many aspects of our lives. So for me, it was such a resonant page. I loved it.
I imagined that the new girl had brought a vase in and put flowers in secretly one day. And I imagined she'd thrown the paper and it had smashed the vase. So it was about things broken being mended again.
What were you most pleased with your own work?
Sometimes you do an illustration and in the middle of it you're so frustrated because you're trying to put in an emotion that you feel and it's not happening. And then other times it happens without you realising you've done it. And then you go, oh, that's worked. And it's all the hands around in the shape of a flower. I wanted the hands to look a little bit like they were part of a flower. There's a sort of texture of a sunflower underneath, and there's the origami flowers on the top. And I wanted all the hands to have a different feel, and each of those hands in my mind was a different character. I've even got one hand with a plaster over a finger and a...
I think that would be such a lovely picture for children to look at, because of all the different little hands and the different skin colours and tones and the different nails and the plasters around fingers, and it's just gorgeous. You can really visualise the sorts of kids to whom these hands belong. It's really lovely.
I mean, Nicola's right. It is impossible to pick out one picture. I mean, I was very, very impressed by the feeling that I got from the shadows that you, rather than depicting the children, to show them as shadows against the wall. So many things.
Yeah, I wanted long, dark shadows and silhouettes rather than the obvious. I didn't want it to be obvious. It's very hard to make something not obvious and to give it lots of different messages.
I think this is a book that will really, really develop children's visual literacy, actually.
I hope so.
Because it's so wonderfully spare. You know, there's sort of space to really notice things and notice all the little details. You know, all the little details that you've put into that shadow picture, the pointing and the kicking and it shows how tangled and unhappy they are, actually. You know, she's just turning her back on it all. She's not happy, but she's like, you know, water off a duck's back in a way.
Yeah, no, for me, she was a very calm,
very
graceful,
calm, very
gracious.
Resilient. And the way that she's followed everywhere by a trail of petals is fantastic. You're so clever.
It will develop visual literacy and emotional literacy too. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time to discuss a book, but we're leaving space for our listeners to go and discover and discuss together for themselves, aren't we? I'm bound to ask what probably seems like a really obvious question. Will there be more books from you as a partnership?
We're hatching one at the moment about a Vietnam veteran who comes home from the war unable to speak with very severe PTSD, and his story of healing is that he's healed by a traumatized cockatoo, and it's told by his little girl. The narrator is his little girl.
And I'm very, very familiar with cockatoos coming from Australia.
Sounds great. I can't wait to read that. But first, we've got to get the new girl out there to meet lots of readers. So thank you both for taking time to join me in the Reading Corner today.
Thank you, Nikki.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.